So let's talk about polygrouping. Polygrouping comes up a lot throughout the course of these videos, and it's something that you really have to understand how to use to be able to effectively organize your model and sculpt in ZBrush. Alongside masking, it's probably one of the two top sort of tools used to isolate and group your mesh so you can work on specific areas at a time. And just like masking, it also serves many other functions with different tools inside of ZBrush. Now, the simplest form of polygrouping is just color coding or color tagging a group of faces so they can easily be isolated. So here I've got polygrouping on all these different parts of the Hellhound model. Now, we created these polygroups to help us create UV shells in the video on UV Master. So that's one example of how polygroups can be used for more than just showing and hiding parts of the mesh. The hotkey to show and hide polygroups is Shift F, and that turns this button on here. This button has two words inside, which are sub-buttons. There's line, which is the polyline, and fill, which is the color. So if I turn both of those on, that's typically what your polygrouping is going to look like. Polyframe with color coding. Now, if I Control-Shift-Click on a polygroup, I can isolate it. Control-Shift-Click-Drag on the background, I can invert visibility. And then Control-Shift-Click on the background again shows all. So these faces aren't going anywhere. They're not being disconnected. This is still one contiguous mesh. It just allows me to easily isolate pieces to work on them. So polygrouping is generally accomplished by isolating a portion of the mesh by using Control-Shift-Click and drag. So there I can see just the face of the mesh. And then go to Tool, Polygroups. And here I can click Group Visible, and that groups just the visible faces. So if I Control-Shift-Click on the background, you see that now has a new polygroup. If you want to change a polygroup color, just click Group Visible again, and you can cycle through all the different available colors. So let's take a look at the Polygroups menu here and see how this will work. So we have auto groups. Now auto groups will polygroup everything that is a separate object. So this subtool for the Hellhound body, that's just a single object. So it's just going to get a single polygroup. Now the teeth, on the other hand, if we solo those and zoom in, you can see the teeth have multiple objects. So if I auto group the teeth, you see each thing that is a separate piece gets a separate polygroup. Some of these teeth are actually connected under the root, so those become a single group. Now if we go back up to our Hellhound here and go back down to polygrouping, we have UV groups. Now UV groups will assign polygroups based on UV islands. So what that means is if you've got UV shells outside 0 to 1, then this will generate UVs based on those. So let's take a look at how that works. I'm going to go back to my tools and let's load up a tool here. We've got the Hellhound multiple UDIMs. So I'm going to step down to my lowest subdivision level and I'm going to import an OBJ file right here, the Hellhound UDIMs. And if you watch the video on UV Master, you'll understand what's happening here. So I've got UVs outside 0 to 1 now. So if I go back down to polygroups and click UV groups, you see I now get UVs based on my UV regions. There's also auto group with UV. Now that will work on the mesh that has just a single UDIM. So if I undo back to my original model and click auto group with UV, that will give me a polygroup per UV island in a single UDIM. So each individual UV island will get its own polygroup. Be careful with this because it is possible that this can change your poly order, your vertex order. So be aware of that if you do use this in a pipeline or production situation. Now we have the option to merge similar groups. If we go to the teeth again, select that one. If I go to merge similar groups, anything that's similar will be merged. So polygroups, merge similar groups. And there you go. You see similar objects get the same polygroups. That's nice when you're polygrouping something that is bilaterally symmetrical. I can then make sure that these teeth share a polygroup, so if I Control-Shift-Click on them, I get the same two teeth on both sides. Or if I have my brush, for example, if I take the standard brush and go to my brush controls and go to auto masking, I have mask by polygroups. If I turn that on, those two teeth have the same polygroup, so I can still sculpt symmetrically. If I didn't have the same polygroup on those, it would only sculpt on the first polygroup it touched. Now we have regroup by edges. So if we go to regroup by edges, you see that will polygroup based on the edges here. So everything with a different edge gets, or with an edge differential gets a polygroup. And we can adjust the edge sensitivity here. So if I were to turn this up and then regroup by edges, turn it down and regroup by edges, well, that's turning it down all the way to 0. There we go. We can have a lot of control over that. Now there's group by normals. So group by normals is going to group based on surface curvature. So as we look here, you can see what we're getting. And I can control the angle tolerance if I turn this down and group by normals. You can see the difference that we get here. See those faces that have a different normal? Those are getting a different polygroup. Group visible we've already seen, and we've got regroup coverage and regroup clusters. If I take coverage down and then group visible, you see that we actually get a random pattern of polygrouping. Now this might be useful for various situations. We can also adjust your clustering with this slider here. Typically, I have this set to 1, and I'm just grouping visible like this. I only really want to see a single polygroup with group visible. There's group front, which will group the front faces. That's very, very handy if you've got an object that you can snap to a front view and you want to group front. And we can adjust that angle. Right now it's set to 90 degrees. We can turn this down and group front, and you see that that will bring the angle around to the front view. We can also turn on additive grouping. So as we start to adjust this angle, it will add to our group. Let's turn this down. There we go. So instead of creating a new group, it is adding to the group. Now let's go back to the body here. Step back up our subdivision levels. Now we have the ability to group masked. So if I have a mask drawn on an object, let's say we've got a mask drawn here. Oops. Make sure that we've actually got the masking brush. There we go. We've got a mask drawn on here. Go into frame mode. If we go down to polygrouping, we can group masked, and that will group the masked areas. Now, when you're doing hard surface, you might decide that you want to polish those groups. So you can turn up polish and then group masked, and all the masked areas are going to receive a pass of polishing. So you see the detail in these areas is going to go away once that polygroup is established. So there you go. That's actually polished those areas down a bit. If we undo that, you'll see that detail pop back. We have the ability to group mask and clear the mask. So if I click that, it will group mask and then it will clear the masking. It is still applying a polishing though, because we have that slider turned up. So what we want to do is turn that back down to make sure that that doesn't apply again. So we'll undo and then turn that down. Now group mask and clear mask does exactly that. It groups the masked faces and then clears the masking. We'll undo that. Now we have group as Dynamesh sub, and I think this is one of the most interesting and kind of useful other than grouping visible, UV grouping, and auto grouping. For this, let's go ahead and create a Dynamesh. I'm going to open up a polysphere. And let's go to Geometry, Dynamesh. Say no. Now we've got a Dynamesh here. Now let's say, we'll turn off frame mode. Let's say that we have B for brush, I for insert, and we're inserting a primitive. Now we've done this in a few of the other lessons where we want to do a subtraction. So we hold down the Alt key and that makes that a subtraction object. And then if we execute our Dynamesh, it carves that hole away. Well, there is another thing that we can do here, where if we take an object, let's say we draw this sphere on here, and let's say we move this sphere into the surface like this, and maybe we make a few copies of it, like so. So I have these objects. If I Control-Shift-Click, you see that even though I haven't executed my Dynamesh yet, these objects have polygroups. So I'm going to Control-Shift-Click to isolate these. I'm going to go down to polygrouping, and I'm going to click Group as Dynamesh Sub. Now that gives it a white polygroup. So now I'm still in Dynamesh mode, but I haven't executed Dynamesh yet. If I Control-Click and drag, those will be subtraction objects. So that's a really handy tool to have there. It's just Group as Dynamesh Sub. Now lastly, we have a group from Polypaint and group from masking, and these are both very handy. If I have Polypaint on this object, so we go to RGB, Color, Fill Object, and then let's take the standard brush with the drag rectangle stroke and alpha 8. We'll grab a color here, and we'll draw out. Turn off the add and turn on RGB. Let's turn the fall off down on our brush so we get a really sharp Polypaint. Now, if I click from Polypaint, go to frame mode, I get a mask, or pardon me, I get a polygroup based upon that polypainting. And the polygroup is only going to be as fine resolution as the underlying mesh. So were I to undo this and then turn off Dynamesh, and then let's say we added a couple subdivision levels here, so we have a much, much denser mesh, then if we do a mask by Polypaint, or excuse me, polygroup by Polypaint, you see we get a finer edge there. Now lastly, we have polygroup from masking. So if I were to create a mask here, now you say, we've already seen polygroups from masking. Well, we've seen group mask, and clear mask. This, however, is quite interesting. If we create our polygroup based on this, go into frame mode, you see it's created just a standard polygroup. If I undo that, and then I've got the tolerance, the masking tolerance here. If I turn this up and then run the mask, it's going to polygroup based on the fall off the edge of that mask. So it's a nice way to get these sort of edge rings of masking, of polygrouping around your mask. So you might recognize this as something that's a component in group looping and polylooping in the hard surface video. So it's the similar algorithm, it's just this is not cutting an edge loop around that area. So it's nice to have access to this and to know that this is something that is available. So I encourage you to experiment with polygrouping. It's one of the most important tools, I think, to understand inside of ZBrush, like I said, as you're going about your day-to-day working in the program. Masking and polygrouping are just two really important tools that you have to understand. And just to make this menu a little bit simpler, the ones that you're going to use the most often are auto groups, UV groups, and group visible. Those are the ones that will really play the largest role in your life. In hard surface, you'll be using group masked, potentially some of these others, but those three are really the main ones to be concerned with. So that concludes this look at polygrouping. I hope you've enjoyed this and it's clarified some of the nuances of this tool, and I'll see you in the next lesson.